The title of Lady Lazarus comes from a Sylvia Plath poem, which is about someone she calls a death artist, someone who performs her suicide for a crowd. It's kind of a grotesque, exaggerated figure that I think reflected Plath's concern about the way her life story was being confused and conflated with her poetry. So the novel, Lady Lazarus, is about Calliope Bird Morath, who is a contemporary confessional poet in the Plath vein, and she's the daughter of Brant Morath, who was a very famous punk rock star in the early 90s who committed suicide when Calliope was just 4 years old. The character who's writing Calliope's biography is a washed-up music journalist. He had had a career in music journalism back in the early 90s punk resurgence. He had covered Brant Morath and his band, Terrible Children. The novel's narrated both by the biographer character and by Calliope herself. So in that sense, it's both a biography and a memoir. There's a kind of tug-of-war going on between the two narrators over who gets to tell Calliope's real story. And one of the things I was interested in is the number of literary frauds and literary hoaxes that we've seen in the last decade, whether in journalism, people like Jason Blair at the New York Times and Stephen Glass at the New Republic, or later memoirs, the problems with James Fry's memoir, A Million Little Pieces, and the outright frauds of people like Margaret Seltzer and Misha Di Fonseca. One of the byproducts of both the celebrity culture and the history of the poets like Plath and the rock stars like Jim Morrison and Cobain, whose life stories have gotten so caught up with their art, is that we have a real problem nowadays as a culture reading literature as anything but autobiography. We're desperate to read things as being ripped from the headlines. I think naming that character, Andrew Altschul, was a way of getting readers to kind of come face to face with the strangeness of their own expectations or their own desire to read novels as memoirs or as autobiography, when novels are works of fiction. They're beautiful lies, as John Gardner said. I've always been interested in the confessional poets exactly because it's so hard to read their poetry and just judge it as poetry rather than mixing it up with what we know about their life stories, the fact that we know about Plath's suicide or the suicides of other poets like Anne Sexton and John Berryman, all of whom were wonderful poets, but we can't read their work nowadays without thinking of their life story. And I think the same is true for a certain breed of rock stars, Jim Morrison, Kurt Cobain. These are people who, when we listen to their music now, we're automatically accessing all of those old stories, and it's a similar phenomenon. And so the novel is equally about poetry and punk rock because I see them as being related or joined historically in that way. The early 90s alternative rock scene is very important to me personally because I was a radio DJ through the late 80s and right up until late 1991. And I was working at a radio station that was nominally an alternative rock station, but what I remember of the music of the late 80s was really not very interesting, very overly produced. It just didn't have much fire to it. And about 6 months after I stopped doing radio, I heard Nirvana's album Nevermind for the first time. And I think my reaction to it was not that different from many people's reaction to it, which was to feel that something had just happened that was going to change the music world forever. What started as a revolution in the early 90s pretty soon turned into a business model for the music industry. They turned around and tried to repeat the success of these bands. They basically looked for clones of some of these very successful bands, and the music industry kind of cannibalized itself. What was interesting for me was how a figure like Kurt Cobain or Eddie Vedder or any of the people who got very famous and very rich during that time, what it would have felt like to them to see their music taken away from them and turned into a cheap replica of itself. The character of Brant Morath, among other things, experienced a lot of misgivings, a lot of inner turmoil about the ways that his music was being packaged and sold. And his widow, Penelope, also has tried very hard to maintain control of his legacy, maintain control of his image in the media and how he is remembered. We think of poets now as one of the less celebrated American art forms, even though there's incredible poetry being written in this country every day. What most people don't realize is that before the internet and before television and before rock and roll, the poets were the rock stars of the art scene. In the 1920s and 1930s, when Edna St. Vincent Millay gave readings, she would sell out halls the size of Radio City Music Hall. There would be lines around the block in Chicago for 3 or 4 nights running when she came to town to give a reading. The same was true of people like Robert Frost, or a few decades earlier, William Butler Yeats in Ireland. So it was true in the past. I don't know whether it could be true in the present. One thing I asked myself when I was writing this book is, under what circumstances could a poet become this famous again? Under what circumstances could a poet be treated as a rock star in our culture? And the answer that came to me was, if she was already famous for some other reason. If the public already knew her name and was fascinated or even obsessed with her life story. We're obsessed with celebrities, especially with young female celebrities, and all the better if they are mentally unstable or have a history of drug abuse or abuse their children or were abused as children. We have a very, I think, sick relationship to celebrities in this way. It reflects an obsessiveness in our culture, and the way that the media focuses on these figures, to me, always has a sexual overtone to it. We're obsessed with their sex lives. Britney Spears' entire reputation originally was built on the supposed fact that she was a virgin. And so Calliope is experiencing a lot of the same things. The media, ever since she's hits puberty, is obsessed with who she's sleeping with, whether she's sleeping with anyone, if she's straight, if she's gay, if she's bi, rather than reading her poetry, which is what she wants more than anything, is to be accepted and respected as a poet. I think a lot of the novel verges on the satirical. When you're writing about popular culture, and especially about media culture, it's almost impossible not to be humorous at times about it. I mean, some of the things that you can see just by turning on the television any day and seeing what they're making television shows about, you either have to laugh or just run away screaming. I often found myself trying to exaggerate it, to make it look crazier than it is, but failing, because you actually can't make this stuff up. Truth really is stranger than fiction. One of the things that's most tragic about Calliope is that because she was born into a famous family, and because ever since the day of her father's death, the media has never left her alone, I don't know whether she's ever had the time or the space to find out who she really is, who the real Calliope is. It's something that she writes about. It's something that the biographer writes about. But when you're bombarded with so many messages and images of yourself by the media every day, and you're so young that you haven't formed your own personality in any solid way yet, I think it must be very hard to know who you are. And so if I could talk to Calliope or ask her anything, I would ask her who she really is. And I don't know that she would have an answer for me.